Hello, it's Jen Taub. Welcome back to Booked Up, a podcast that features you, me, and our favorite authors. This week, my guest is Ben Smith, author of Traffic, Genius, Rivalry, and Delusion in the billion-dollar race to go viral. This hot new book takes a close look at the people and patterns behind the clickbait journalism world that helped inflate Donald Trump, but also gave us a renewed faith in humanity with an endless supply of baby animal rescue videos. I should have said Traffic is a buzzy new book with a kind of knowing wink, but this is a podcast, so you can't see me wink. You know Ben Smith from his role as a founding editor-in-chief for Buzzfeed News, where he released the Steele Dossier to the world. I've always admired him not just for this bold move, but also for how he supported his reporters, Anthony Cormier and Jason Leopold. Today, Ben is the editor-in-chief of Semafor, a new global news organization that launched last year. Just before that, he was the media columnist for the New York Times. During his 2-year stint there, Ben's stories were frequently a must-read for either my securities regulation or white-collar crime class. We'll get to all of that. Let's dive in. So where are you, actually? In Brooklyn?
Yeah, at home in Brooklyn. Just got back from Washington. You wear a lot of hats. I was just sort of Google stalking you a little bit. You have a lot going on.
Oh my gosh. I don't think that I have ADD. I used to only have one job, but when I worked in the like the corporate law world, or I was an in-house lawyer, when you have those kinds of corporate jobs, you know, as you get better at things, you just get more responsibilities, right? And then like if you leave, they need to hire 5 people to do your job. But like out in the other world, like I just add new jobs because I can't just do one thing. I mean, you too, right? Or do you only have one job now?
No, I have a lot of different jobs.
Which are?
Well, I'm running a newsroom and also writing and reporting, and also we're hosting a lot of events.
Okay, so is that why you were in DC?
Yeah, we had a big thing called the World Economy Summit. This is the first. I basically almost always work from Manhattan, but and this is the first time I've recorded from here in a while, and I have just realized that this is the best place to do it. So
okay, so but like, so now that you're at Semafor, is that how you pronounce the name?
Yes.
Is it? Do you have a building, or is everyone kind of virtual?
No, we have. It's funny. We thought about. I mean, and it sort of makes sense in this day and age to start remote. Like, you don't want to go spending money on real estate, and everyone is very comfortable remote. But it turns out when you're starting a new thing with a bunch of strangers, it's really important to be in person. And actually, the time you most need to be in person is in the beginning. And we found ourselves spending all our time in my partner Justin Smith's home, which eventually, he would come in and I would be lying on his bed taking a conference call. And I think it got a little old. And so we have a beautiful, beautiful space in Washington. Where Gallup is a partner of ours, the polling firm, and so they've graciously shared their really beautiful space with us. And then in New York, we have a small office upstairs from Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street, which is probably, I would say, less beautiful space. Although it's funny because it's very much the kind of space in the kind of neighborhood that all the people I wrote about started up in. And in fact, our CTO, Mark Wilkie, was the CTO of Buzzfeed and of HuffPost and helped design Kinja. And so for him, going to Chinese restaurants on Canal, stepping out from the office is this sort of strange throwback to the old days.
I think it's good, though, to have offices in DC and New York to get the pulse there, being down in both cities, obviously across the river for you. So I'm curious, this Smith guy, you're not related, right? I mean, Smith is an uncommon name, but
we are not related.
Okay. Well, so it's funny having you on as a guest is somewhat unnerving because having read your reporting as well as this book, you are someone who so carefully observes people, And so I'm like, So it doesn't surprise me that you Googled first, but this is my interview of you. And so you're not actually allowed to ask too many questions because that happened before. A.M. Holmes, do you know who she is? She was on as a guest and she started asking me questions. And the next thing I knew, she was like in control of the interview. So I'm onto that technique.
Yeah, I interviewed Stephen A. Smith recently, the
really?
ESPN host. And it was like, at some point, it was like, I'm I have totally lost control of this interview. There's no stopping this man. He is going to say whatever he wants to say it extremely well.
So even though I said this is about you and not me, I noticed that you have that you talk about one of the key characters in this book is Nick Denton, who's sort of like a friend rival figure, I guess. And through his eyes, you write about this admiration for the outsider. And because I'm a Midwesterner who came east for college, I always think of myself as a sort of Nick Carraway from the Gatsby, or something. Funny, I would never think of myself as Daisy, but that's just the way it works. But I like what you wrote, and so I'm gonna read this about these two different people, and then I ask you a question. So one is Jonah Peretti, who was your boss and was the head, or is the head of Buzzfeed. And you put it this way. One of the few people who noticed Jonah, in fact, was Nick, who saw him in just the sort of person he liked, saw him as just the sort of person he liked to collect, a clever outsider trying to make his way in New York. And then about Jessica Cohn, also known as Foxy Jess, you wrote, within a week of moving to the city, she had made her way to Camp Bowery, where she met A.J. Delario. He talked her into writing short-term items for the Black Table, but her sarcasm and outsider posture, her Michigan roots showed, caught Nick's eye. And there are others. But then I looked you up because I was wondering if you were one of these transplants, but it turns out you're like a born and bred New Yorker, New York prep schools, live in New York, always have. So at first I thought you were writing about outsiders either with admiration or commentary about why they could kind of go up against traditional media. And then I wondered if you had some sort of disdain for these folks. And I wonder why you put this through Nick's eyes.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I definitely, because I came up on the internet that really kind of related to the outsiders in media. And I think there's a very interesting question of whether any of us were authentically outsiders and what even that means. But it was a moment, I think that's something that was so clear to me looking back at this scene, where to be writing on a blog as opposed to in a magazine meant you were an outsider. Mm-hmm. And that people who felt themselves to be outsiders, by the way, legitimately or not, right? Nick's father was this extremely well-connected British academic. So it's I think there's, but certainly people who saw and felt themselves to be outsiders one way or another, and it also just required a certain, professional decision that you weren't going to try to make your way by climbing the greasy pole of an institution. Mm-hmm. Which seemed, by 2010, the institutions were all in shambles, and that was the obvious thing to do. But in the year 2000 seemed, in media, like kind of a slightly strange thing to do. And so it was certainly something that ran through all these folks, that they were kind of alienated from one way or another, the existing institutions that they were challenging.
But what about you? I mean, you were at Politico, and that was sort of an upstart kind of new media type company. I don't remember. I think you graduated from Yale in maybe 99.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right? What did you, and you worked for the Herald, not the Daily News, which I guess is a little bit of an outsider.
That's a pretty thin claim to outsiderdom, working for the slightly less fancy Yale newspaper. Yeah, I didn't really get into student journalism that much. I went to the organizational meeting of the Yale Daily News, which is this big, important thing, and was so intimidated by the other kids there. I worked for it.
It wasn't that important, trust me.
Well, it felt itself to be very important. The people
maybe by
there
the time
thought
you
they
were
very
there.
Important. And at least that's how it felt in the organizational meeting, and I was just like, I'm intimidated by these people, and kind of slipped out the side door halfway through. And I think, just bounced around a bit, went to... Can
I just cut you off for 1 second
sure.
before that? So you made the mistake of going to the organizational meeting. I showed up on my 20th birthday when I had been out drinking. I was smoking a cigarette and feeling depressed about my life. And my friend Richard dragged me along because he was filing a story. And back then we had like real typewriters, like manual typewriters. And he dragged me in and I met the features editor, and that was the end of it. I wouldn't have liked an organizational meeting. It was pretty low key on a Saturday night.
You sound very cool.
I'm not trying to sound cool. I was depressed. Okay, and I go back. So then you leave. You didn't do student journalism. What did you do right after college, though?
I got a job working for the Indianapolis Star, covering cops. And I'd been into journalism. I had summer interns at the Jewish Forward in New York, and really loved that.
I worked at the Detroit Jewish News one summer.
Oh, there you
go.
But
you're half Jewish, right? I forgot this, right? Okay.
The correct half.
Oh, boy. Like I'm not going to, it matters. Okay, go ahead.
So
you moved to Indiana?
Yeah, moved to Indianapolis. It was a fellowship after college. Covered cops. Really, totally loved it, but also applied. It was a moment when, and you probably remember this. People wanted to go to Prague. Like Prague was the cool global city that people were going to. The way maybe Athens actually is right now, and Istanbul and Berlin were in the intervening period. And in any case, it was at the time Prague, and I had actually studied Czech among other things in school for. What? I can't even remember totally why. So I thought I was very qualified to get a job at the Prague Post and wrote an application letter, not realizing that, of course, the only way you get a job at the Prague Post is you show up, drunk with a cigarette in your mouth. And so got no response, but sent off the same letter to a bunch of similar sounding places and wound up with a job at the Baltic Times in Riga, Latvia, where I spent a couple years as a reporter.
And how long did you work there?
I was in the region for a couple years. I became the stringer for the Wall Street Journal out there, which was a very elevated job for which they paid me $500 a month.
How did you live on that?
Well, it was $500 a month plus a per story fee. It was pretty cheap to live in Latvia.
And was there I'm trying to imagine is it like the food there? Is it kind of like smoked fish? Is it kind of like Eastern European Jewish food in Latvia?
It's potatoes and dumplings and dried fish and good stuff.
You bicycle or walk to work there? Like, what is it like? Or is there buses?
I was a pioneer in working from home.
Okay. So I don't know why I got off on this detour, but somehow you end up at Politico, right? At that point.
Yeah, no? For me, it was, I think, sort of the same impulse that makes you think, and it's actually a lot of the people who were on that early internet had also kicked around Eastern Europe, which was, for a bit, because I think if you were a journalist who, whether because you felt, for whatever reason, didn't want to try to get a job as a junior coffee maker at Time Magazine and, work your way up to the pinnacle of power in New York. In the 90s, a lot of those folks went to Eastern Europe because it was sort of where the news story was. Right? It was an interesting time. Matt Taibbi started this notorious, really fascinating publication in Moscow called The Exile, but lots of people did. Nick Denton, who had found Gawker, was a reporter in Hungary. These were really interesting stories, too, and it's an interesting moment. So I then, after I got back to New York, worked for the New York Sun, which was a conservative broadsheet founded by the guy who had run the Forward. But it was just when the internet was becoming a kind of legitimate way to do journalism. And so, and I spent the 2004 presidential cycle reading all these blogs about John Kerry and George Bush, which were incredibly influential. Right. And covering New York politics locally and at some point was like, oh, there isn't anything like this for New York politics. And so I was at the New York Observer then and started a blog to cover the 2005 New York mayoral race between Mike Bloomberg and Freddie Ferrer, I guess it was. And because it was just the only thing. And it was just, this whole universe of sources and political junkies. It was really small, like 2,000 people. Nobody cares about local politics then or now. But it was sort of the right 2,000 people. And so, and it was just incredibly fun to be in this running conversation with my sources, with interested, smart, random people who were following the story. And so then started a couple more blogs and was hired at Politico in 2007 when they were starting this, something that clearly in retrospect, like The Verge, was basically professionalizing these blogging tools and taking, and so, in 07 started there.
Okay, I want to sort of do the jump cut because, you're mostly, of course, at this point, for people who might know who you now, I think people might remember most your work on, as the first editor-in-chief at Buzzfeed News. And I'm trying to remember what year did Jonah bring you over?
In 2010, I was at Politico for about 5 years, and then in 2011, as it had become totally clear that Twitter was swallowing these blogs that I had kind of spent the last several years working on.
It was a run up to the 2020,
the 2012 election.
Yeah. Okay. So you're over there, and I think it's there. I mean, to me, I think I first realized who you were when you stood beside or sat beside your reporters, Anthony Cormier and Jason Leopold, when they were being lambasted for releasing the Steele Dossier, or it might have been one of the other stories. Like you were sort of on my radar.
You mixed a couple of Trump era stories, but basically,
there was the other story that in the middle of the night.
Thing.
The directed. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I'm mixing up the one where
there was a dispute that I think sounds totally bananas in retrospect over
whether Donald Trump had directed Michael Cohen,
quote unquote, directed Michael Cohen to lie, or whether Michael Cohen was just
about the Moscow deal, right? It was about the building.
No, it's more complicated.
Oh, sorry.
But that's a third story. I think this is a rabbit hole there's no point going down.
But the reason why I like this rabbit hole is whenever I see the word that Donald Trump directed anyone, I always tag Jason Leopold on Twitter.
Good. Oh, I'm sure he appreciates that.
He does. I've talked to him before about FOIA. Yeah, he never forgets, because there was a moment in the middle of the night it was either like early 2017 or early 2018. It might have been early on, where we thought, that's it. Trump's done, which was so stupid in retrospect. But I thought it was really cool that you always had their back, because not all bosses will do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really core part of being an editor, basically, of what you want in an editor, is defending you when you get into trouble.
But even though I'm conflating a bunch of different stories, I want to go back to the Steele Dossier, which is, I was really impressed in your book that you took that on. I don't think you have anything to apologize for, and yet you did consider some of the criticism about releasing the document. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of what you were thinking then, and what you think now, and how that's settled in?
For sure. Yeah, no, and I think, it was a kind of interesting exercise to write this book. What is it like, a few years later, and just sort of take a breath and try to think back through all those questions in a moment, in a different moment with the benefit of hindsight. We had the document. A lot of journalists were sort of, given the document off the record and sworn to secrecy by Fusion GPS, which had assembled it and which was hyping it, and
that's a Glenn Simpson company.
Yeah, and basically, and telling people that they should take it really seriously, and that we didn't. We got it sort of through a side door, essentially, and so we weren't bound, I think, to secrecy about it the way everybody else was. And so as soon and it had already started to bleed into the public eye. Like Harry Reid had written this letter in late October to the director of the FBI saying mysterious stuff about Trump and Russia, basically. And there were a series of other kind of glimmers of like everybody seems to be talking about some body of information that we don't have, that isn't public. And by January, it had been briefed both to Obama and then to Trump. Numerous members of the Senate, lots of people in the press were talking about it. And it was kind of, if you were trying to understand, like, what is John McCain doing right now? Like, why is he acting the way he's acting? You sort of needed to say, because he's read this dossier that says that Trump has been compromised. And so we were starting to have conversations about, what do we do with this thing? As well, but we'd also, though, sent reporters to Moscow, sent reporters to Prague. We're trying to run down the allegations and stand them up or knock them down. And then CNN reported that these documents exist, these explosive documents. They'd been briefed to two presidents, and that they indicated that Trump had been compromised. So it wasn't like...
And can you just... I remember, of course, in excruciating detail, the pieces of it, but can you just, for those who are listening, give us the quick bullet points of what was sort of what the document was a compilation of, what the things were that were said, regardless of whether they panned out?
Yeah, it was a compilation of allegations about Trump and his campaign, some of which were kind of interesting and true, and widely known, that the Russians were playing games on social media in particular to try to get Bernie Sanders supporters alienated from Hillary Clinton. And others were incredibly lurid and specific, involving Trump, having really exotic and explicit sex in the Ritz-Carlton Moscow.
Oh, we can say the P-tape, suppose.
So,
we can say
the P-tape, as it became known. And lots of other similar, but often very detailed stuff. A secret trip by Michael Cohen to Prague. By the way, I should stop now and say, like, some of which has been disproven. Like,
yes,
there's just zero evidence that Trump went to Prague, and a lot of it
that Michael went to Prague, right?
That Michael went to Prague.
And I totally believe him, yes, about that.
Yeah, and lots, and we published his passport soon after that. I mean, it was, and lots more that hadn't been stood up. And when we published it, I mean, my thinking, which it is now, is you just can't, the idea that, CNN or a Democratic politician could stand up and hold a sheaf of papers in their hands and say these papers contain, incredibly damning secrets about the president that we're not going to share with you, it just isn't tenable.
Because the document itself stands for is the story, as opposed to, I mean, you can go through and verify, but the fact that people are holding on to something becomes a story. And I think that's important to have shared it. I don't, but I think it's curious to me that, that Glenn Simpson or whoever was shopping it around put people under restrictions of confidentiality.
I mean, that's normal. You give somebody something off the record, it was off the record.
But the purpose is then for them to try to hunt down sources and substantiate. Is that why you do that?
I think that's right. But that's not that abnormal, except that the document had clearly kind of influenced how everybody saw the world, even though they hadn't been able to stand it up. So I think we just thought the document itself was obviously a story. The notion that, we could all the elites could see it, but that it would burn regular people's eyes out if they saw it didn't really make sense to me. Nor does it now. And a court later found that this was, definitionally a document of public importance.
There you go.
We published it. We published it with a, short but pretty forceful disclaimer saying we hadn't been able to stand up or knock down the allegations, and actually that there were specific errors in it that made us nervous. Mm-hmm. We published that, to the website with a link to a PDF. And I think if there's one thing that I would have back, it's just that the way that PDF immediately detached itself from that URL.
Yeah, it could have had a watermark, right? I mean, you could have put a watermark.
We could have screenshotted it onto the web. We could have watermarked. We could have, in some sense, stapled the context to the document. Because the thing that I didn't really expect, and the thing I've really noticed across media lately, is that these documents become sort of totemic. Like, people are obsessed with. I first noticed it when I went to a Hillary Clinton event or maybe it was a Trump event in New Jersey in October of 2016. And there was a guy standing outside yelling, WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks. And I asked him, because I'd been up that morning reading through WikiLeaks, and was like, what in particular struck you? She's like, the whole thing, WikiLeaks. But he wasn't really in the weeds, let's say. And it just was a sort of symbol of Hillary Clinton's corruption. You didn't need to know anything about it to know that. The way Hunter Biden's laptop, like, what is the laptop about? What's in it? Just like bad stuff that shows CRT, how Joe Biden is bad.
Or anything. Or like the 1619. Well, those are less.
Yeah, those are specifically the way these documents sort of secret documents that emerge into the public. And for a lot of people who hated Donald Trump, the dossier became sort of symbolic of he's a Russian agent without your having to reckon with the details or prove things up to a normal journalistic standard. And that, I don't know, I guess I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, I mean, but it's good to, I guess that's good to know, but I don't know that you could have. So I'm starting there because that's when you kind of came on my radar screen. And then of course you left there and were this fantastic media editor at the New York Times. And I always loved reading your column, especially when it touched on some sort of white-collar crime or securities fraud. I remember when, I guess it was Ozzy, was at some sort of website, and you wrote this incredible expose about it, and the place just shut down, which, it's great. You didn't have to even have congressional hearings, and tons of people didn't have to lose a lot of money. You just wrote a story, like in the good old muckraking tradition. So I commend you on that. Did you get any pushback on that one?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, that was a story where when I was writing it, the core, they'd been mildly deceitful or very deceitful in a number of kind of low stakes ways, and then had also impersonated somebody on a conference call when they were raising money, which was pretty egregious. And no, they tried very hard to prevent us from publishing. I think told us that if we published, the guy who did it, he was having a mental health crisis and it could put him in danger. He's since pled guilty to federal crimes. But yeah, no, people always do try to stop you from publishing this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I've read, read the book Bad Blood, and, John Carreyrou faced the same kind of, if you're getting really close to, where the bodies are buried, everyone gets nervous. So there's that. But then reading this book, though, was amazing for me because being able to go back in time and to step back further and look at the context of everything we're talking about here in the name of the book, which is traffic, right? And traffic, it has a lot of connotations. We're talking about, eyeballs. We're talking about memes. We're talking about anything going viral, either being pulled into a site or pushed out and distributed, whatever we want to say. And I didn't realize your connections, or really Jonah at Buzzfeed's connections to the very first incidents of something going viral. And you begin your book that way. Before I ask you about that, am I right to see? So I love the way this book is structured. I want to make sure that I understand what you were trying to do. I really like that there are many very short chapters. I like that it seems like there are two kind of rival camps of folks trying to deal with gating traffic virality, and that's the Jonah Peretti at Buzzfeed, and then you have Cameron Marlowe, but he was just a friend of Jonah's. He sort of stands in, I think, for Nick Denton's world over at Gawker. And then, different people we've heard of through the years, whether it's Andrew Breitbart or what is it, Jezebel, like different of these famous sort of very buzzy, highly popular web startup sites kind of fell into either camp or maybe crossed over. Is that the kind of story that how it works?
Yeah, I think I guess I would put it a little differently, which is, okay. I guess I sort of, and particularly, I went into it without necessarily knowing what I was going to find. Actually, it was sort of a period where I wasn't there. I arrived a bit later, but had always heard stories and been very curious about this kind of origin moment of basically today's media environment.
Right.
And that origin story. And yeah, I think what I found were these people, but particularly two very smart, very ambitious guys, Jonah Peretti and Nick Denton, who in some sense had discovered the power of digital media to both spread information and make money, and thought they could in some sense control it, and had different theories about how that would work. But I think in both cases, a certain amount of hubris too.
Because back in the day, because I think when you were doing this stuff, back in the 90s, I was working at a company and we were doing a lot of internet advertising. It was in the 90s. Company sort of ended up in a dustbin of white-collar criminal history, but that's another story. But so I remember when things were banner ads, right? And what was an impression versus what was the conversion rate versus what all this stuff like. So let me just say that you and the folks in the book start equating traffic with money because that's how advertising dollars work. But obviously, things have changed a little bit over time. But I want to go back to that origin story. And I get the sense that Jonah Peretti has told this story a million times himself. But can you tell me?
Of course,
tell me the story about Nike. It's so good.
And I think in some sense, what was different about that old internet where, publishers were publishing things on the internet and people were looking at them, to an internet where sort of anyone was putting things on the internet, and how successful it would be determined by a sort of, did they catch on? And in some sense, that's the era that maybe we're at the end of it now, but it's the era we live in now. So Jonah was a grad student at MIT. He'd been this, kind of clever kid, and went to UC Santa Cruz and studied, and then was a teacher in New Orleans for a bit. Dyslexic, and felt himself certainly to be a bit of an outsider, and very brilliant, and but also very much kind of a prankster by nature. Like that was sort of how a culture jammer in the term of the day, and he was procrastinating on some thesis work at MIT, basically, and noticed, and he's also a sneakerhead, and noticed that Nike was letting you customize sneakers, and had read something about Nike's sneakers being made in sweatshops, which was a big issue of the day, and tried to customize the sneaker with the word sweatshop, and got a polite email back from a customer service representative, representative that said that it didn't meet their terms of service, and he then read the terms of service and said, actually, it does, because it's a word in the English language, and here's the definition from Webster's dictionary, and had this sort of insane, pedantic 17 email exchange with some poor customer service representative, which I think ended with him saying that he understood and didn't need her to make the sneakers, but could she send him a picture of the 7-year-old in Vietnam who had made the sneakers to go along with the sneakers. She did not respond to that.
I mean, that is just so brilliant and dark. And this is what I read that I thought of, and I think that you might be too young for this, but did you ever read the prankster Laszlo Toth's letters? Does that sound familiar to you?
I never did, no.
Oh my God. Okay, so he played a character on Saturday Night Live, Father Sarducci. But he had this book.
Oh, okay. I'm familiar with Father Guido Sarducci.
Okay, so
sure.
It came out in 1976, right? And he had this book, and it was a collection of very earnest prankster letters, like he would write to like major corporations, like I ate and I had my Big Mac, but it had only like one less pickle but it's. My older brother was this kind of person who would have that book around, right? And you have to. It's like the Onion before Onion. I have to tell you.
I'm writing it down now. Okay. I'm going to get it.
Yeah. And I couldn't believe adults could be so funny. And its genius, though, was you couldn't really tell if it was satire or not. And again, of course, that's the nightmare we're living in now, right?
In some ways, that's right, yeah. And so Jonah's letter, which he could have packaged into a book, and actually the first thing he did with it was submit it to Harper's Magazine, which had this reading section, which would kind of collect things like that. Yeah. And they rejected it or didn't get back to him. And so he forwarded it to a friend who had a website that we would now call a blog. And he forwarded it to a few friends, and pretty soon all of his friends have forwarded it to other friends. One of them has put it on this website that we would now call a blog. And within a few weeks, he gets a call from a producer for the Today Show who has seen it because it's now kind of a social phenomenon, and finds himself sitting on the Today Show with Katie Couric, and with the spokesman for Nike being piped in. And Jonah doesn't know anything about sweatshops. He studies media studies at MIT. He's not, and is totally kind of substantively outmatched, but has just so fully captured the attention of the audience, and kind of, I think he sort of realizes, like, gosh, like, I'm a bit of an imposter here, but I've also, but I think he basically believed it and was, in some sense, this kind of anti-capitalist activist kid, and also realized that he had kind of discovered some strange new source of power. What was interesting watching that segment again, it's actually hard to dig this stuff up, but I got somebody to share with me that old Katie Couric clip, is that the Nike spokesman also kind of gets it. And says repeatedly, well, we're just so glad that people are talking about our great products.
Right. Well, no, but so that also reminded me of something, and I'm sure you must have seen this. This must go back like around 8 or 10 years ago. There was this, I guess this really bad eyewear company, some shyster, who people would order their glasses and then he would send them, and they'd be like the wrong prescription. Does it sound familiar? It was like crappy glasses. And so everyone would like write up these terrible things, like bad reviews and like, don't shop here. But then the Google algorithm, because he was written about so much, pushed him to the top. And you're just like, really, there really is no bad publicity. Just spell my name right? Just spell the URL right. Yep. So that's the Jonah story. And also, you keep saying in the book, Jonah Peretti's sister is this comedian, Chelsea Peretti. And I didn't realize, so I Googled her and I'm like, oh my God, she's Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I didn't realize that was the same.
Yeah, and the two of them had sort of come up in New York doing weird stunts together. They had a website that they made called Black People Love Us. Was the other famous one.
Satirical,
a cringe-inducing sort of testimonial website for a white couple about how cool their black friends think they are.
And the trouble again with that, I think it's really funny because it's cringe, but yet some people might think it's real, right? There's that line where you shouldn't have to wink at someone to let them know it's a joke, but apparently these days, I think people just don't get it. Like when Donald Trump launched Truth Social, I think it was like around April 1st of last year, I said, hey guys, it's been real, but I've taken a new job. I'm really excited to share. I'm going to be the general counsel at Truth Social. And literally, people I didn't know were coming up to me. I was at a critical tax theory conference of all things. And I'd never been to one before. And someone at the conference came over and said, congratulations on the new job. I'm like, what?
Well,
why would
lawyers.
I be here? Tax lawyers. Oh.
Maybe tough.
My next book is on tax. Don't insult tax lawyers. They're pretty interesting. All right. Okay, so that's the Jonah side. And then Jonah ends up doing, actually, don't go away. I don't want to leave Jonah for a second, because his fascination with things going viral is kind of how he continued. You describe him when you were working with him at BuzzFeed, or maybe before you got there. He would sit there, and what is the name of that pseudonymous byline? Lily Boo. That Jonah has this thing, and I don't know if it's, of all the people in this book, I completely relate to him, and I think I must be like related to him, because he'd sit there around for hours and just play around with just different memes just to get to see what's going to catch fire. Also his management style, that he just sort of like doesn't tell people what to do. I just like everything about him. But can you describe this whole thing he was doing to drive traffic? And sorry, like one last thing. It seems like both his website as well as what was going on at Huffington Post, there's always this sort of like, here's our legit news stories that we have, but that makes us feel good about doing journalism. But that's not really what's getting people to the website and getting advertisers to pay. It's this other schlock stuff.
Yeah, Jonah's described it as the mullet strategy: serious up front, party in the back. When he was at HuffPost or Huffington Post, it was then known, and really kind of created that huge well of traffic out of people who could say they were reading about Iraq, but were really clicking on barely clad celebrities.
Right.
But he also, who's very interested, and this feels in this sort of age of AI very relevant, in how, are there ways in which you can kind of like scrape people's preferences from the internet and figure out what they want based on that. And so he had gotten somebody to write a script that would resort the website Pinterest based on certain things. So he could pull up a page and have it sorted by the cutest dogs according to Pinterest posters, and then have it basically ported wholesale into a BuzzFeed page that would say the 40 cutest dogs. Slightly to my relief, that never totally worked. Like, lots of people would click on that, but the thing that was written by the human would always do a little better.
Oh, that's good. Although I do have to say, I like to use ChatGPT for recipes. I swear it's really good. I got a really good, I was too lazy to go up to my bookcase and get a cookbook down, so I have my phone. I really am that lazy. And so I found a really good recipe for saag paneer, but that it used cream. I'm like, could you do this with like vegan? And they came up with a coconut milk version. I swear to you, I'm lazy. Okay, but there's this other thing, though, and I'm not going to leave his world quite yet, that you just said about how, fortunately, it doesn't all, everything just sort of didn't work that way. But there's also, when things do, work that way. In other words, when things really took off and went viral, sometimes folks like Facebook would change the algorithm. And I'm thinking about the dress, and I'm thinking about Upworthy. Can you talk about those instances where it's not where we might, there are instances where I do get renewed faith in humanity. I am one of these people who sometimes needs to see someone rescuing some cute animal. It helps with the endorphins or whatever. But I also want to hear about
sheep from lakes. Never gets old.
Oh, right. But I'm also really into really detailed other stuff. So can you talk about that, and maybe the dress, and how people freaked out when things actually do go viral in a really nice way?
Yeah, I would say there was this, and the book sort of goes through this kind of cycle in which new media companies like BuzzFeed are sort of informing these platforms, like particularly Facebook, about what people want, and Facebook is responding to and building these metrics around engagement. Do people like it? Do they share it? That, we should show it more widely to their friends. Well, actually, maybe we should show it to everybody, not just their friends. And But then, of course, people who are looking for traffic catch on to that and are optimizing for engagement. And we started to see really weird stuff. And particularly that people arguing and disagreeing is what would make things go most viral. We did a quiz on which state should you actually live in that was kind of broken. It cascaded down alphabetically, and like everybody wound up in Wyoming. And a lot of people were like,
Wyoming
"You're idiots, I don't
isn't
want to live
bad,
in Wyoming."
But Wyoming's have you been to
everybody
Cody?
on the entire internet.
Okay.
It's beautiful, yes. But at some point, everybody on the internet has seen this quiz because Facebook is sort of reading the signal, which, by the way, is actually telling you it's a little broken, as this is great. And the most actually totally delightful, because it's just the world's lowest stakes argument and massive one for us, was this dress that, and it, in a way that made me really kind of, at its best, BuzzFeed was just totally part of this sweet kind of like pre-Trump internet, where a young woman at a wedding in Scotland had sent an image to our social media editor and said, "Hey, we're having an argument about this image, and whether I think I'm losing my mind, but some people think it's white and gold, and others think it's blue and black. Can you kind of ask the BuzzFeed community?" And pretty soon, the editor looks at it and she's like, "That's obviously white and gold. What's wrong with you?" And then a couple people standing behind her are like, "No, that's blue and black." She was like, "Okay," puts it on the website. What I remember about that was a colleague of mine was in Jakarta giving a speech. I was in New York, and his speech was like 9 a.m. in Jakarta, and we had posted the thing at 7 a.m. Jakarta time, 7 p.m. in New York, roughly. And by the time he got on stage in Jakarta, it's all anyone was talking about. It was like instantly, globally viral. And we thought, wow, this is a cool new kind of global culture. Somebody at Facebook later said to me, this was a huge bug in the system. The notion that like one thing could just suddenly, without any controls, be served to everybody in the world is pretty scary.
But why?
I didn't really contemplate at the time.
Why is that a bug? Can you explain why you think they think of that as dangerous?
I think not that much later, a guy shot up a mosque, live streamed himself, served. I think there was a sense that, there were really dark things popping up in digital culture as well, and that Facebook had lost control over their own system, and they were. They never really caught up to it, and there were lots of reasons that they liked that as well, and that they liked all the engagement. But they certainly were starting to get nervous about it. And what we saw is this kind of like triumph they were pretty nervous about.
And I think they were also probably, with this and those kind of goofy sort of pablum upworthy things, I think anytime someone's leaving your space, then they're not engaging on Facebook. Like Facebook wants you to stay there, not sort of leave. And so I'm sure that it is, I agree with you, things are scary if there's no firewalls. Okay, so I've talked a bit about sort of, and I know you probably don't think of it this way, but I sort of position, sort of Jonah as a sort of the good side, because he's willing to walk away from a ton of money, which because he wants his freedom, which I think is great. And then I think of Nick, although he kind of, his heart warms at some point, that I think Nick Denton was really kind of vengeful and sadistic in this book, and also sort of
it's really interesting. A lot of people read this book very differently, and it's been really interesting. Some people thought Jonah was the hero, Nick was the villain, and some people read it exactly the opposite way, which has been very gratifying. As a writer,
are wrong.
I'm still figuring it out. Yes,
I don't think of Nick as a villain. I actually think him as quite interesting and entertaining and playful and stuff, but that he didn't. I think that he let his employee AJ spiral into, it seems like, an addiction. And some of the shit that he was doing, you kind of allude to it at the beginning of the book. He just had no line that he wasn't willing to cross. And, I had the whole thing with the Hulk Hogan sex tape. I've heard arguments on both sides. In fact, a friend of mine from college, and I'm forgetting, now I'm spacing out what her name was. She was a year older than me. She was the lawyer in-house at Gawker. And there are people who still strenuously say this is a First Amendment issue. And I'm like, we didn't have to see that case, right? There's no reason why they couldn't have just taken it down. I don't know. But what I was impressed by, though, in your book, and it made so much sense to me, is there was a time when celebrity sex tapes were different than they were by the time the trial happened, because now everyone has an iPhone and anyone can have like a dick pic or whatever. Whereas back when this was first being done on the sort of wild, wild web, it was, people like Paris Hilton became famous because of it. Or you gave this example of this other guy who was like, okay, fine. And that it was really, I don't know. I mean, do you want to speak to that? Because I can't, it bothers me. I don't think it's newsworthy. So.
Right. I mean, I think there was basically, and Nick had this sense that people in media and the consumers of media were total hypocrites who were pretending to be interested in one thing and actually interested in another, and that the internet could sort of, could tell you the stories that these journalists really knew and were afraid to tell about powerful people, and give you, the audience, the thing you actually wanted and were afraid to say. He also said a porn site. That's the most literal embodiment of that, I guess.
Right.
But I do think that it's so hard to think about a moment in which you could imagine it was just in the slightest way acceptable to share somebody else's intimate images or videos in any context, much less on a website as a journalist. I mean, just without consent. I mean, I think it was a totally different moment before the sort of digital reproduction of videos and images was something we all took for granted, and lots of people have things on their phones that it would be embarrassing to share. And
right, the concept of revenge porn.
Right, and Gawker had played around in the sort of, and not really been burned by it in the very early days, when it was sort of like, in some sense it was laughing at celebrities, which is a great American sport, even if it's pretty cruel sometimes. But kind of kept doing it as it became more darker and darker, and as the culture really turned totally against it. And I do think it's, Gawker's destruction by the billionaire Peter Thiel is this incredibly troubling phenomenon that, where Thiel sort of, because he was unhappy with some gossipy stuff that Denton had written about him, which wasn't the greatest journalism history either, but then secretly financed a revenge campaign. Incredibly troubling. I do think you have to separate that from Gawker, was publishing stuff that was going to get it sued by somebody, maybe not with that level of sophistication and lawyers that fancy, and that no jury was ever going to say, yeah, great, published people's stolen sex tapes and refused to take them down. Right. I mean, it was that was really, by 2010, 2011, 2012, 2015, when the trial was, something that was like culturally totally indefensible.
And, and I'm not going to be explicit about it, but like the stuff that AJ said at the deposition, I mean, it didn't make him a good witness. But other than that, there's so many, even though I'm sort of reducing this to two, streams of stories, that's not really true. I mean, your profiles of all the people here are really interesting and complex. And I think you do an incredible job writing about women. And not everybody does, not even women. And I love that your women characters, they're real people, portrayals are fair and complicated. And I hope that the people who, when they read the book, are happy enough about them.
Complicated portrayals. I'll settle for happy enough. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that there were, like, when the story was written at the time, it was a story about a bunch of guys, and going back, it did see, I mean, you could there were a handful of women who really did a lot of the work and also created and figured out a lot of the things that all of us are, still basically doing on the internet.
No, I thought it was great though, because I'd heard of sites. I don't think I've been to Jezebel that much, but I didn't really know what they were doing over there. And you talk about it, and I think it's good and it's complicated. So we have the person that you write about that I was so pleased came across really well was I guess our mutual acquaintance Elizabeth Spires, who I only met accidentally. I think I knew her on Twitter, and I didn't know this whole backstory with her. And I think she comes across quite well. Yet another one of these sort of outsiders, but she's somebody who I don't go to a lot of like cocktail parties, but I was in one in New York in late 2021. And I saw this person, she's kind of petite. She was wearing like these incredible shoes. And I'm not totally a fashion person, but she looked really smart and had this like smirk on her face. And I wanted to talk to her. So I just complimented her shoes and we spent an hour talking. She's incredibly sharp-witted, smart, interesting. And so I'm glad she came across really well. You say this about her because she ends up going to, I mean, she's done a lot of things. I think she worked at the New York Observer later, but I think she was at Gawker, and then she was maybe at the Observer. I don't know what she's doing now. Anyway, so you write this, the former finance blogger Elizabeth Spires infiltrated the Condé Nast cafeteria, camouflaged as a Devil Wears Prada era assistant in a wrap dress and fuck me, you boots, and wrote at length for Gawker about a company culture that revolved around a grand cafeteria with high school politics. I mean, that's a good assignment for her. That's so great. But there was this other thing when she first came up in the book, and because this is not safe for work, I'm not gonna. But I love that you put stuff like this in because that's
isn't anything safe for podcasts? I mean, people with their headphones on.
Everything is safe for podcasts.
Nobody's
but
playing
I checked
this
with my
on their
husband.
speakers at work, Jen. You're okay.
Okay, no, but I was going to read. I read this to my husband. I'm like, I want to read this out loud on the pod, and he's like, you can't read that. And so maybe I'm going to. You know what, Michael? Fuck off. I'm going to read this. He can't tell me what to do. Okay, so one thing that AJ apparently, this is the guy who ends up getting, Gawker destroyed, who seems like a great guy and has gone through a lot of stuff. So I don't want to make it sound like he hasn't had his own evolution. But it says AJ's own specialty was over-the-top, crude interviews with members of their own small scene. Quote, would you rather let George Wendt pee in your mouth or have Shelley Long wear a strap-on and ram you in the hiney for 22 minutes? He aspires in one interview, riffing grotesquely on the television show Cheers. And then you don't say what she answered. What did she say?
She was wise enough to not give an answer as interesting as the question, I believe, but I don't quite remember. Now I slightly regret you reading it out loud, honestly. That was so gross.
Oh, damn it.
The internet is it really captures how, like, the point of the internet was to be outrageous and do things you couldn't do in real media. And I do think there was sometimes some people look back at stuff that was done in that period and miss or maybe appropriately skip over the totally different context where you were alternative media sort of like doing stuff that was intended to be outrageous. Yeah.
But you have to, because this is why there was, what's that name of the site? Oh gosh, I'm trying to, the famous site that then led to people creating the whole crazy QAnon stuff. These sites that, you talk about it, these really racist, misogynistic, what are those chat boards called?
4chan.
4chan, right, and 8chan. 4chan, 8chan, and then the whole, like, if you didn't, it's important, I think it's really important that you do have crudity in here, that you don't leave it out, because that's what, like, it's funny because it was incredibly
it's
funny because
sexist.
It's like outrageous, it's just ridiculous, it's crass, and that's part of what the charm was, because, I don't know. I mean, it maybe seem misogynistic or
it's
weird.
Also, I would say looking back, I would say, like, I would almost sort of separate things. There was stuff that was hilariously outrageous at the time and is now, like, not hilariously outrageous, but still just kind of gross. There's also just a ton of incredibly sexist stuff that was totally par for the course in how people wrote about women really recently in a way that, I mean, I was there, so I shouldn't have been shocked, but was still kind of shocked.
I think it's so interesting because there are different spaces where, sexism takes many forms, right? So there's this kind of stuff, but to me, it's more offensive to actually be like saying something important and to have someone look over your shoulder and not pay attention to you than some dumb, teenager joke, but whatever. Okay. So I want to get to you though. You, at one point you talk about, how did you put this? You said you were telling Jonah's story and then, he was emphasizing, I guess, one part of his life and not another. And so you sort of say, you toss out this line, but we all choose our stories. And so, you don't say much about yourself. I'm wondering what your story is. I mean, the one piece I picked up that I thought was the most fascinating thing about you is that your grandmother was a Mark Twain scholar or a Samuel Clemens scholar. And also there was some article, I think that where you were called the Boy Wonder, but like, who are you? Like, what's your story then in all of this?
Do you want to narrow that down a little bit?
No, I want you to. That's your job.
But you mean in relation to this sort of internet?
No, I mean, how do you? Well, because I see you cringe a little bit as I read something.
Do I seem
out
uncomfortable talking about myself? I am, yes.
Yeah, no, I guess what I would say is, where are you? Every person in this book that I see evolved, and so did this media, right? We all grow up, and there's this point where even Nick tells people, take this thing down. And, his staff revolts against him because they don't want to maybe grow up, or they don't want to recognize that the world has changed. And what I love that you said is that you're no longer the outsiders, you're the establishment, you're punching. You didn't say this, but at some point, if you're successful, you're starting to punch down. It's not funny anymore. Yeah. And so I look at where you are now, because now you're like this media mogul kind of person, starting up a new kind of experience. And I was reading, I think it's really great to offer, here's the news, here's the journalist view, here's some counterbalancing views. I like what you guys are trying to do over there. But I wonder how you see your personal evolution alongside this.
My own sort of thing I've always been obsessed with reporting. Like, I love breaking news. It's basically a personality flaw. I have a screw loose, love scoops, love publishing something people did not know and having them learn it.
You know what I love more than scoops?
What?
I love spying. My colleagues here know this. I am such a flipping sleuth. I like digging into stuff no one knows about. But I don't care about being the one who breaks the news.
Right, and I don't know why I like it. Like, I just think, I both like doing it and do feel like it is just doing that in a basically unreflective way is a really important part of journalism. And so,
but why is it a flaw?
Not saying how, I don't know, flaw, whatever it is, it's sort of a personality trait, I would say, rather than something that I'm going to tell you is, that I came to after lots of reflection. And so for me, really, the internet was a tool to do that. Like, I had been a scoopy City Hall reporter who liked to break news in a print newspaper, and then thought, oh, wow, this is an incredible new tool, this blog thing, for getting information into the world and connecting with people who are interested in it, and just genuinely loved doing that and found it incredibly compelling. And in some sense have always been, that's the thing that has always guided me, is thinking about, okay, how can I use this media for reporting? Both for gathering information, for sharing information, for telling stories. And so that was sort of always my place in it. And I think I wasn't like the first blogger. I wasn't particularly early to blogging, which had been around a while. But I think I was among the first kind of quote unquote serious reporters, people who were trying to be fair and who weren't political partisans, because there had been a lot of great, really interesting digging on the left, on the right, into George W. Bush, into John Kerry. But there were not a lot of people who just liked to report and wanted to go figure out what happened and tell you, who were using the internet as their primary medium. And really that was what I spent my time doing.
Okay, so that was sort of so interesting. So can I ask you about your grandmother? What do you mean a Mark Twain scholar? What do you mean?
She was obsessed with Mark. She very honestly had a very difficult life and was a very difficult old lady when I knew her. But she was obsessed with Mark Twain. We had lots of Mark Twain books about the house, and I think she had a very dark view of people that is and of kind of American pieties.
Is this your father's
Twain.
Mother or your mother's mother?
My father's mother. And the thing the Twain essay that I always think of is To the Person Sitting in Darkness, which I don't know if you've ever read, but just this. No. It's written in a sort of as a parody. It's sort of written about the American invasion of the Philippines in the around more than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's addressed to the Filipinos who ought to be so grateful that America is going to come in and take over, but it's just dripping with sarcasm and sort of anti-imperial Twain's actual
sounds like Jonah Peretti, right?
Yeah, but yes, for sure. But also, and I think it's in some sense really, journalists ought to be really, really skeptical about powerful people in government.
It's so hard,
pieties that serve their interests.
Until Donald Trump was elected, I was so much more like, I just want to know everything and I want information to be shared. And that's why I'm very interested in, that's why I write about white collar crime and political corruption, because I think, power corrupts absolutely, right? But then when Donald Trump was elected, I was very worried about the false equivalencies. So, I think about, and that I have to live in this world. But at the end of the day, I think I come down on, sunlight. Always sunlight is important and power is dangerous, I think, at the end of the day. But I worry sometimes about the need. I mean, the need to say, okay, well, if we're going to have, one critical story about a Republican, then we better have one critical story about a Democrat. I don't know that people sit around a newsroom and doing that, but I worry if that's, I don't know what I'm saying. So let me ask you, what did I not ask you that you thought I would? I know. And I want to ask you, this book is about the past. And what about the future? Like, where are things going with Twitter? Is it going to burn to the ground?
The thing that I think I maybe expected you to ask me, because I've read you for a long time, or at least, and maybe the thing that I was most surprised to discover was that, at all sorts of different moments in the reporting, it's like, oh, hey, there's Andrew Breitbart co-founding Huffington Post. There's Steve Bannon looking over Jonah's shoulder. There's the guy who founded 4chan. There's somebody who's going to wind up in trashing the Congress on January 6th. And that a lot of these folks, because, particularly those early days of the internet, there wasn't a sense that, like, it was left versus right. It was these kind of new digital people versus the old establishment people. And so there are a lot of people who really created the current far right, who were very, very close to this scene that saw itself as totally progressive. And, and saw Barack Obama's election in some way as like the culmination of what they'd built. When it turned out that Donald Trump's election was the culmination of what they'd built.
Yes, and you talk about that, and I see that in the book, and I do think a lot about what that meant. The sort of even the Occupy Wall Street movement. I mean, there was definitely an alignment on the far left, I would say, and look at even Steve Bannon's efforts, right? And then now, I think what's interesting, the coalitions have shifted. I find myself more aligned with the sort of never Trumper establishment types. And I think maybe I'm becoming more that way. What I also thought was interesting that I didn't ask you about was how the New York Times, I loved the meeting you write about there, how the Times was sort of lagging behind. And suddenly they figured the whole thing out with paywalls, and they seemed to be they were really positioned. If they weren't ready for 2012, they were ready for 2016. Okay, the last thing I want to ask you is, what's the future, though? Like, what do I invest in now? I want to invest in something.
Semafor.com. You should get
I already follow Semafor, and I do some of the newsletters. But, I can't invest in Semafor.
Well, it depends how much you want to invest, Jen.
No, we can't, because I don't think I'm actually an accredited investor, despite how many gigs I have.
Right, yeah. I do think we're headed toward a much more splintered digital media environment. You're already seeing it. And I don't think I think Elon probably accelerated it a bit, but Facebook, which was the really big social network, has already basically kind of unraveled. Twitter, you see unraveling, and it's partly because of management decisions. It's partly just because social things get old. Bars, nightclubs, websites, people get tired of them. Right. And they go out of fashion. I think, so I would say on one hand, there's this, people maybe healthily are splintering back into sub-communities. I'm not sure that the experiment with everybody in the world talking to each other about the same things at the same time was that great, though I will personally miss it. But you never mentioned
TikTok, because that's not a word-based
I would say that the other thing, obviously, is short videos aren't going, are a huge way that people are consuming less news than entertainment, but all sorts of things for sure. And whether it's TikTok or they ban TikTok and it's something else, I think, that kind of, that for those formats obviously aren't going anywhere.
That's good to know. And do you think Donald Trump's going to win the next election?
I have to say, I made a real resolution after the 26th election to stop predicting things. So I'm going to not make a prediction
here.
You're
really smart, because I will end with this one thing. In 2015, I think was around the time, was it you or someone else in the book was visiting the New York Times? And I visited my friend David Halbfinger over at the Times. He was a Yale Daily News guy. We were in the paper together. And I was like, it was right when I think Maggie Haberman had written that piece predicting, how the Republican candidates were going to do. And there was this, it was very funny. It said the path to the White House. And when it got to Trump, she literally had written the path. There is no path. And I was laughing with David. I'm like, ha ha, that's the funniest thing ever. And we smugly laughed it all off. And I'll never forget what an idiot I was. So I think I'm best not predicting and just maybe interviewing people and reporting. So Well, thank you. I took so much of your time. I really, really appreciate it. I love traffic. I hope it goes viral. Here it is. See?
But I'm glad I got you to read the most disgusting passage in the entire book. And I should tell your listeners there's nothing else remotely that gross in the whole book.
The whole thing is really great, but that was the thing I wanted because it was about my friend. So I swear to God, it's only because I should never have said my husband said not to, because like that is the kiss of death. You can't listen to your husband. If you had one, would you listen to him?
Thank you so much for taking all this time. And I hope folks will enjoy the book. I had a good time reporting and writing it. Thank you.
Ooh, boy. I hope my mom's not listening to this episode. But, it's in the book, and I don't believe in censorship, so there you have it. It was really great speaking with Ben, and I do look forward to following his career at Semafor. I'll be back next week with another show as we continue to explore the writing process and the nonfiction world together. Let us know what you think. Send an email to bookedup@politicon.com. You can also write to Bookedup at P.O. Box 147, Northampton, Massachusetts, 01061. To keep up with the show and our featured authors, follow Booked Up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And please give Booked Up a 5-star review. It really will help other people find the podcast.